Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the UK economy, and specifically to talk about UK pensions. Now, a lot of people have been sending me messages recently saying that I'm only posting negative videos. Well, I'm not meaning to, I'm not a harbinger of doom. I just want to bring you stuff that I think is interesting, and unfortunately, most of the interesting stuff tends to have a negative slant on it. But in today's video, I've got some really good news if you're a UK pensioner or you're going to be a UK pensioner in the near future, because the test has just been set for next year's pensions and they're going to be increasing by 4.7%, which is considerably more than the current rate of inflation of 3.8%. So that's cause for celebration, although I've never seen many pensioners celebrating their pension so far. So maybe this will bring a round of cheers, but probably not. Now, in terms of how pensions work in the UK, they've got what's called a triple lock. And this was introduced back in 2011 by the then Prime Minister David Cameron and George Osborne during the coalition government. And this was done to address the fact that between Maggie Thatcher's time and 2011, the only increases in pensions were either the rate of inflation or 2.5%. There was no link to earnings. So David Cameron introduced this new metric called the triple lock, which basically said that pensions would go up by the higher of the increase in earnings, inflation, or 2.5%. So that seemed like quite a good deal. Now, just before we go on any further today, can I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? It helps me with the algorithm and also helps me to keep a smile on my face. So thank you so much, and let's get back to the video. Now, if we have a look at how that's worked out since 2011, you can see this table here. I've listed the increase in earnings every single year between 2011 and the current figures that we've just got, the increase in inflation, CPI, Consumer Price Index, and the 2.5%. And I thought it was worth having a look to see which one has won the most over that time. And you can see that in the early days, inflation and the 2.5% floor were actually the winner. So that occurred in 2011. We had 4.6% inflation, then 5.2%, then the 2.5% floor, then 2.7% inflation, then the 2.5% floor. Then earnings came into play for the first time in 2016 when there was a 2.9% increase. The floor came back in 2017. Inflation was 3% in 2018. And then since that time, we've seen a combination of mostly earnings and inflation. And if we look at what's happened in the last 5 years since the pandemic, well, we had a suspension in the earnings computation in 2022 because earnings were going through the roof as a percentage increase because everybody had been furloughed during the pandemic. So that year, it was only inflation at 3.1%. In 2023, there was a 10.1% increase in inflation in the UK. So that was obviously the winner for pensions in that year. We then saw 8.5% increase in earnings, followed by a 4.1% increase in earnings. And then the most recent data that's just been published shows that earnings over the last 12 months have gone up by 4.7%. So that's going to be applied unless inflation comes in at a higher level, which it won't do because it's inflation for September, which is estimated to come in at around about 4% in the UK. So over the last 5 years, pensions have actually gone up on average by 6% per year, which I think is actually pretty healthy. When you compare that to what's been happening with inflation, that's actually quite a good deal if you're being paid a pension. So congratulations if you are. I know most pensioners probably won't be cheering this on, but I thought it was actually worth mentioning it. And we'll have a look at the end of today's video, how the UK pension compares to the rest of the G7 and also what's going on in China and India to see whether or not you're better off staying in the UK or whether you'd have been better off living in those countries. But the serious point here, I think, in terms of the UK government is that pensions are actually becoming one of the biggest forms of expenditure. This chart shows the top 10 forms of public expenditure in 2025, the year to April 25, which is the end of the tax year in the UK. And you can see that the biggest single outlay was healthcare, predominantly the NHS. That represented £193 billion of spend, 19% of the total. And year on year, that increased by around about 4%. State pensions are now the second biggest form of expenditure for the government. That's 13% of total expenditure, and that was up 11%, and it's going to rise by another 4.7% next year. So it's rising rapidly, and we'll come back to talk about how that's being funded in a moment. Education's number 3 on this list, 119 billion, 12%, followed by debt interest at 105 billion. That's 10%. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that currently yields are at their highest level for almost 30 years in the UK, close to 5%. So that debt interest bill is rising through a combination of an increase in the amount of debt and an increase in the actual cost of the debt per pound of debt. So that's likely to keep rising, could overtake education at some point in the next 12 months if we keep seeing the yields at the current levels. Now, defence down the bottom here, I think, is worth pointing out. 55 billion spent on defence. That is less than half of what's being spent on pensions, less than half of what's being spent on debt, or around about half what's being spent on debt, 5%. Now, Donald Trump wants that figure to increase, probably to more than double, because he wants NATO to be spending 5% of GDP on defence. So there's going to be pressure on the UK government to increase that figure. Now, going back to how the state pension is funded, it's funded by what's called national insurance. And national insurance is a form of tax that's taken from both employers and also employees. So both companies and individuals pay this, and it goes to the state. However, those national insurance contributions are not ring-fenced. So the money doesn't go into a special fund that's only available for paying pensions. It just goes into the general government funds, which they then use to fund pensions. Now, national insurance actually is more than the cost of the pensions. The pension cost at the moment is around about 2/3 of what the government is pulling in through national insurance. But the reason why it's increasing national insurance is because it's got a huge deficit. The public expenditure is a lot more than what the government is pulling in through taxes at the moment. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that as a result of that, the UK government is continuing to borrow more debt, which is putting more pressure onto the budget because it's increasing the interest bill. So this increase in pension costs will hurt the UK government. It's going to increase its expenditure, and therefore it will need to find more money to cover this increase through the triple lock. Now, I mentioned earlier that we would compare what's going on in the UK with the rest of the G7, and also have thrown in a couple of other countries for good measure. And this table shows what you could get as a pensioner in all of those countries. And the USA actually appears twice in this table because there is a range in the USA. It's not a standard payment for everybody. You can actually earn more than the average if you earn a very high salary. And that salary, I think at the moment, is around about $169,000. So that's what you'd need to be earning through your working career to get an increased pension payment. So if you were lucky enough to absolutely max out in the USA and get the maximum possible state pension, then you would get a gross pension at the moment of over $48,000. So you'd rank right at the top of this list. And I put a UK pound equivalent just to, for the comparison, and that's around £38,000. But even if you haven't been earning megabucks in the USA, the average retired state pension is still better than it is in the rest of the G20. You'll pull in around $23,700, which equates to around £18,700. Germany comes in at number 3 on this list, equally tied with Italy. Both are paying €19,800, which is around $21,400. Australia is next on the list with just under 30,000 Aussie dollars, which is around $19,300 US dollars or £15,200. Canada is next with 26,000 Canadian dollars, which is around 19,000 US and £15,000. France pays 16,800 euros, around $18,200, £14,300, We've then got the UK, which comes in at number 8 on this list, paying just over £12,000, $15,500. And Japan, you will only get $12,300, around £9,700. And then I thought it was worth mentioning what's happening in the two biggest countries in the world, China and India. If you're a pensioner in China, you can expect to get around $5,900 per year, which is around £4,600. And in India, it is only $430, which is about £340. So I thought it was worth sharing that data just to see how you feel about where you live and whether or not your pension is fair compared to what's happening in other developed economies. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think pensions are a really interesting topic because it's at the government's behest how they decide to increase pensions. And back in 2011, the UK decided to put into place this new triple lock system whereby pensioners get the benefit of the highest number from 2.5% or inflation or earnings growth. And what we've seen for the most recent data is that earnings over the past 12 months have gone up by 4.7%. So pensions will be going up by the same amount. And earnings is becoming the biggest player in terms of which of those three metrics is being used to set pension growth. And that's great if you're a pensioner because on average, you've been getting an increase of about 6% per year for the last few years, which is considerably ahead of the amount of inflation. But unfortunately for the UK government, they're going to have to find a way of funding that increase. And this comes at a time when the UK is already running a deficit of more than £35 billion. So this is going to add further to the burden, potentially mean that it will have to take on more debt. And as we've talked about, the yield on that debt is increasing. It's at the highest level for around about 25 years. So that's going to add further to the debt costs, which are already one of the biggest expenditures for the UK government. And all of this is proving to be a real headache for the new government because they're constantly seeing costs increasing. And so the only way of funding that is going to be to increase taxes. Now, we've got a budget coming up in November. There was already going to be an increase in taxes, but this increase in pension costs is likely to add further to that increase and cause more pain for people who are working in the UK. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supported me. If you bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Patreon, YouTube member, or Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me motivated, and here's something to put a smile on your face.